My name is Adeline, and if someone had told me years ago that one day I'd walk into a courtroom to face my own parents, I would have laughed.
It would have sounded like something out of a soap opera.
But life has a way of writing stories you never expect. I was 24 when everything began, young, ambitious, and determined to build a life far away from the coldness that had defined my childhood. My parents had always been emotionally distant, treating me more like a burden than a daughter. Growing up, I learned to depend on myself because if I didn't, no one else would. My grandfather, on the other hand, was different. He saw something in me that my parents never cared to notice. He used to say, "Adeline, one day they'll realize what they lost when they ignored you." At the time, I didn't quite understand the weight of his words. He was a man of quiet strength, a self-made millionaire who built a business empire from scratch. Unlike my parents, who were always chasing social status and appearances, he valued loyalty, character, and hard work. I spent most of my teenage years with him, helping around his estate, listening to his stories, and soaking in every bit of wisdom he shared. He treated me not like a child, but like someone he genuinely respected. When I graduated college, he gave me my first investment. Not money, but guidance. He helped me start a small consulting agency, something I had dreamt of but didn't have the courage to do alone. Under his mentorship, that tiny venture began to grow. Then unexpectedly, he passed away. It was a crisp autumn morning when the call came. I remember the way the world seemed to stand, still as I listened to the voice on the other end of the line. My grandfather was gone. I hadn't even had the chance to say goodbye properly. The funeral was elegant but cold. My parents were there, of course, but their presence was more performative than sincere. They greeted relatives with practiced smiles, talking about arrangements and appearances. But not once did they look at me with genuine emotion. A few weeks later, his lawyer contacted me. "Adeline," he said, his voice firm yet kind, "your grandfather left a will. We'll be reading it next week. You should attend." I didn't expect anything significant. I was simply there to honor him. But what happened in that room shocked everyone, especially my parents. The lawyer opened the envelope and began to read aloud. To my parents' horror, the entire estate, properties, businesses, bank accounts, and investments, apart, had been left to me. Every single thing. He hadn't divided it or set up shared trustyships. He had left it all, without hesitation, to me. My parents' faces drained of color. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line while my father sat stiff, pretending to stay calm. But I could see the storm brewing in their eyes. After the reading, there was a thick silence. My parents didn't say a word to me, not then and not for weeks after. But behind the scenes, they were busy, very busy. I started receiving letters from lawyers, each more aggressive than the last. At first, they demanded a fair share. Then they escalated to formal claims, arguing that I had manipulated my grandfather, that he wasn't in his right mind when he wrote the will, and that as his only child, my father was the rightful heir. It was both insulting and heartbreaking. The day I received the court summons, I remember standing in my office, holding the papers, my hands trembling slightly. Not because I was scared of losing. I had every legal document on my side. But because the very people who gave me life were now treating me like an enemy. My parents, who had ignored me for most of my existence, had suddenly remembered I existed the moment money entered the picture. Friends advised me to settle, to keep the peace, to avoid the spectacle. But something inside me clicked. No, this time, I wasn't going to shrink myself to keep anyone comfortable. This time, I was going to walk into that courtroom not as the forgotten daughter, but as the woman my grandfather believed in. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully. A cream-colored blazer, tailored pants, my hair neatly tied back. Not too flashy, not too meek, just enough to make a statement. I'm here, and I'm not backing down. As I walked toward the courthouse, cameras flashed. My grandfather's estate was well known, and the media loved a family scandal, but I kept my head high. When I entered the courtroom, the air shifted. My parents were already seated at the plaintiff's table. My mother rolled her eyes dramatically the moment she saw me, as if I were a child who had wandered somewhere I didn't belong. My father whispered something to her, and they both smirked. It was a cruel, familiar gesture, one I had seen countless times growing up. But this time, it didn't hurt. It fueled me. I walked past them calmly, taking my seat beside my attorney. As I placed my bag on the table, the judge entered. Everyone stood. Then as the judge sat down and looked at the case file, something unexpected happened. He froze. He looked up at me, then back at the file, then at my parents. His brow furrowed. "Wait," he said, glancing between us. "The charges are against you?" The entire courtroom went silent. My parents shifted uncomfortably. The judge's tone wasn't neutral. It was sharp, almost incredulous. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, flipping through the pages again. "You're the legal heir, Miss Adeline."
The will is clear.
I sat there, silent but steady, watching as the narrative began to unravel in front of everyone.
The same parents who had dismissed me all my life were now being confronted.
Not by me, but by the law and the truth they had tried to twist. I'll never forget the look on my parents' faces when the summons arrived. They had assumed, in their entitled, overconfident way, that they could bully me into submission the same way they had ignored me for years. They didn't expect me to have a team of lawyers already prepared, nor did they know that my grandfather's legal advisors had been working with me for months. As the court date approached, I could sense their panic growing behind their carefully composed exterior. My mother would post glamorous pictures online, pretending nothing was wrong, while my father gave smug interviews to a few local reporters about family misunderstandings, as if this was all some minor issue we'd laugh about over brunch. What they didn't realize was that I had no intention of backing down. I had spent my entire childhood being treated like a burden, an inconvenience they were forced to tolerate. Now, for the first time in my life, I had power, and I wasn't afraid to use it. The morning of the hearing, the city courthouse was buzzing. The case had attracted attention. After all, not every day did parents sue their own daughter for millions, left to her by a wealthy grandfather. As my car pulled up to the courthouse steps, a small crowd of journalists swarmed forward, snapping photos and calling my name. I stepped out in a sleek cream-colored suit that gave me the aura of quiet authority. I had spent hours carefully choosing that outfit, not because I wanted to impress my parents, but because I wanted the entire world to see me as the woman I had become: confident, unshakable, independent. When I walked up those stairs, I wasn't the forgotten child anymore. I was Adeline Hartwell, the legal heir to one of the most influential fortunes in the state. Inside, my parents were already seated with their lawyers. My mother wore her usual icy expression, the one she used whenever she had to deal with anything remotely uncomfortable. My father, on the other hand, looked impatient, as though this entire process was a tedious formality that would end with me obediently handing over my inheritance. The moment they noticed me walking into the courtroom, my mom tilted her head slightly and rolled her eyes with theatrical annoyance. It was the same gesture she used to make whenever I'd tried to speak as a child, dismissive, belittling, as if my very presence was a nuisance. My father leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, whispering something smug to their lawyer. I could practically feel their condescension radiating across the room. But then something happened that none of us expected. The judge, a stern man with a reputation for his no-nonsense demeanor, looked down at the case file, then up at me and froze, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Wait," he said slowly, his voice carrying through the quiet courtroom. "The charges are against you?" His gaze shifted from me to my parents, as if trying to make sense of a bizarre puzzle. "Are you telling me," he continued, addressing my parents' lawyer, and that the plaintiffs are suing their daughter for inheritance left to her, legally and rightfully, by the deceased? The room went silent for a heartbeat. Even the journalists outside the courtroom, who had been allowed to stand near the back, stopped whispering. Their lawyer fumbled for words, clearly not expecting the judge's immediate disbelief. "Your Honor, yes, but there are complications," he stammered. My father sat up a little straighter, suddenly less confident. My mother pursed her lips, irritated that things weren't going exactly as planned. Meanwhile, I stood there with my chin raised, calm and collected. I didn't need to say anything. The facts spoke for themselves, and for once they were on my side. My grandfather had made sure every legal loophole was sealed shut. He had trusted me completely, even when my own parents had not. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen thoughtfully against the bench. "I must say," he remarked almost to himself, "this is one of the more unusual cases I've seen in a while." He glanced at me again, his expression softening slightly. "Miss Hartwell, please take a seat. I believe this is going to be an interesting morning." I nodded politely and sat down beside my attorneys, my heart steady. Years ago, moments like this would have made me crumble. I would have felt small, insignificant, desperate for their approval. But that girl was gone. In her place was a woman who understood her worth. As the proceedings began, my parents' arguments quickly unraveled. Their lawyer tried to claim that I was influenced into receiving the inheritance, that my grandfather had been mentally compromised, in his final years. But their claims had no evidence. I had spent years caring for my grandfather while they partied in Europe and posted vacation selfies. There were countless witnesses, legal documents, and recordings that proved his decision had been made with complete clarity. Every attempt to paint me as manipulative or undeserving only highlighted their own greed. I watched their frustration grow with each passing minute, and honestly, it was both heartbreaking and satisfying. Heartbreaking because these were the people who had raised me, or rather, neglected me. Satisfying because finally, they couldn't twist the truth anymore. By the end of that day, I realized something monumental. The power dynamic between us had shifted forever. No matter how the case ended, they would never again look at me as the insignificant daughter in the corner of the room. They might not love me, they might not respect me emotionally, but they could no longer control me. And in that quiet, powerful realization, I found a sense of peace I had been searching for my entire life. When the court adjourned for lunch, I walked outside into the crisp afternoon air, my heart pounding not from fear but from adrenaline. For so many years, I had avoided confrontation with my parents. I'd learned early on that no matter what I said or did, they'd find a way to twist it, to make me feel foolish for daring to stand up for myself. But that day was different. I could feel the eyes of reporters on me as I descended the courthouse steps. Cameras flashing, microphones extending toward me. Questions filled the air like buzzing bees. Adeline, how does it feel to face your parents in court? Are you confident you'll win the case? What would your grandfather think about all this? I paused for a moment at the bottom of the steps, letting them take their pictures. I didn't answer any questions. My silence was intentional. I had no interest in turning this into a media circus. The story would tell itself through facts, not sound bites. I gave a calm, controlled smile, one that said, "I'm not afraid anymore," and then turned to walk toward the quiet corner of the courtyard, away from the frenzy. As I sat down on a bench under the shade of an old oak tree, my lawyer, Mr. Collins, joined me. He was an older man, sharp-minded with decades of courtroom experience, and one of the few people who had treated me with genuine respect since my grandfather's passing. "You handled that beautifully," he said, adjusting his glasses as he sat beside me. Most people would have broken under that kind of pressure. "I've had a lifetime of practice keeping myself together," I replied, my voice calm but carrying a weight of memories. "They taught me early on that emotions were weaknesses to be mocked." He nodded, understanding more than he said. "They underestimated you," he remarked. "That might just be your greatest advantage in this case." I thought about that for a long moment. It was true, my parents had always seen me as someone easy to dismiss, someone who would never fight back. That's why they rolled their eyes when I walked into the courtroom. They genuinely believed I'd crumble the moment things got serious. They didn't know about the years I spent building a life for myself while they were too busy pretending I didn't exist. They didn't know that I had studied business and law not to impress anyone. But because I wanted to understand how power worked, I had watched them misuse their influence all my life. I wasn't going to repeat their mistakes. After lunch, when the court resumed, the energy in the room felt different. My parents' lawyer looked nervous now, flipping through documents as if searching for something that would save their sinking case. My mother's usual icy composure was cracking. She kept tapping her manicured nails against the table, a small but telling sign of her impatience. My father was whispering harshly to her, clearly blaming her for how things were turning out. For once, their perfect facade was slipping in public. And I watched, not with glee, but with a strange sense of detachment. I realized that I wasn't here to destroy them. I was here to defend what was rightfully mine and, in a way, to defend the version of myself they had tried so hard to silence. As the hearing continued, we presented testimonies from people who had known my grandfather intimately during his final years. His longtime caretaker, a kind woman named Evelyn, spoke about the bond he and I shared. She described how he often said I was the only one who visited him regularly, the only one who listened to his stories, who treated him like a human being instead of a bank account. Her words were powerful, sincere, and undeniable. Then came his lawyer, who explained how carefully the will had been drafted, how every clause was checked and double-checked to prevent exactly this kind of lawsuit. By the time the witnesses were done, the judge's expression had shifted from curiosity to clear disapproval toward my parents. My parents' strategy, built on arrogance, was collapsing. They had no substantial evidence to support their claims, just entitlement. My mother tried to take the stand and deliver a tearful monologue about how unfair it was. how she felt betrayed by her own father, but it came off as forced and insincere.
Even the judge seemed unimpressed.
My father's turn was worse. He tried to argue that I wasn't responsible enough to manage the fortune, implying I was still some naive child. I almost laughed at the irony. They were the ones who had never paid attention to who I'd become. They didn't even know about the companies I'd quietly started, the scholarships I'd funded in my grandfather's name,
the investments I'd grown on my own. They had no idea that the little girl they'd ignored had turned into a woman, fully capable of handling herself. As their weak performance unfolded, something profound happened inside me.
For years, I had carried around the pain of their neglect like a heavy, invisible weight. I'd imagined confrontations 1,000 times in my head, shouting matches, tearful reconciliations, dramatic apologies that never came. But here, in this sterile courtroom, surrounded by strangers and legal documents, I felt something I didn't expect. Freedom. I didn't need their apology anymore. I didn't need their approval, their love, or their validation. For the first time, I was truly standing on my own, and it felt exhilarating. When court was dismissed for the day, I walked out not as a nervous daughter facing her parents, but as a woman who had finally found her voice. The media swarmed again, but this time I didn't shy away. I gave a brief, composed statement, thanking the legal team and expressing confidence in the judicial process. I didn't mention my parents by name. I didn't need to. My strength spoke louder than any insult they could throw my way. As the cameras flashed, I saw my reflection in one of the courthouse windows, not as the forgotten Adeline. The final day of the trial arrived with a strange calm. It was as if the air itself had grown heavy with expectation. As I walked through the courthouse doors, I noticed my parents standing together near the hallway, whispering furiously. My mother's usual icy mask was fractured. There was a visible panic in her eyes, though she tried to hide it behind forced poise. My father looked older than I had ever seen him, his shoulders slightly hunched, his arrogance dulled by exhaustion. Seeing them like that didn't make me happy. It simply confirmed what I had known deep down all along. They were never invincible. They were just people who had spent too long believing their power would never be challenged. Inside the courtroom, the judge's demeanor was different today, too. His tone carried a quiet authority that silenced the chatter in the gallery. The moment he entered, my lawyer, Mr. Collins, leaned towards me and whispered, "This is it. Stay composed. You've already won more than you realize." His words resonated. He wasn't just talking about the legal battle. He meant the emotional war I had silently fought my whole life. The proceedings began with the judge summarizing the key points of the case. He spoke methodically, almost clinically, but there were moments where his voice carried subtle undertones of disapproval. Directed
squarely at my parents.
He pointed out how the will had been legally airtight, how their claims were built on nothing but personal grievances and entitlement. He noted the credible testimonies that demonstrated my grandfather's clear intentions. As he spoke, my parents' lawyer shifted uncomfortably, occasionally wiping sweat from his forehead. My mother clasped her hands tightly on the table, as if squeezing hard enough might stop the inevitable.
Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the verdict.
The judge looked directly at my parents first. "This court finds the claims brought forth by the plaintiffs to be without merit," he said firmly. Not only is the will valid and legally binding, but the defendant has demonstrated capability, responsibility, and integrity in managing the inheritance left to her. The plaintiff's lawsuit is hereby dismissed in its entirety. The sound of his gavel striking the block echoed like a thunderclap in my chest. For a moment, everything went still. My parents sat frozen, my mother's jaw clenched, her carefully curated composure crumbling before my eyes. My father stared at the table blankly, as if trying to process what had just happened. And then, slowly, I exhaled.
It was done.
Years of neglect, dismissal, and silent suffering had led to this single, resounding moment of justice. But the story didn't end there. As the judge began to rise, he unexpectedly added, "Additionally, given the baseless nature of this lawsuit, the court orders that all legal fees incurred by the defendant are to be
reimbursed by the plaintiffs."
My parents' lawyer visibly flinched. My father's eyes widened. My mother's face flushed with humiliation. That was the final blow. Not just losing the inheritance they thought they could take, but being held accountable financially for their greed. As I walked out of the courtroom, reporters rushed in again, eager to catch my reaction. But this time, I didn't avoid them, nor did I hide behind a polite smile. I stopped at the top of the courthouse steps, turned to face the crowd, and spoke clearly. This case was never about money. It was about respect, legacy, and truth. My grandfather believed in me when no one else did, and today his belief was honored. The applause that broke out surprised me. Strangers, people who had followed the trial from afar, clapped and cheered. It wasn't the attention that moved me. It was the realization that my story had resonated with people who had faced their own versions of betrayal and injustice. Later that week, something unexpected happened. My parents came to my office. It was late in the evening. Most of my employees had already gone home. I saw their familiar silhouettes through the glass doors as they hesitated outside, almost like strangers who weren't sure if they were welcome. A part of me wanted to ignore them, to let them stand there in the cold as I once had so many times growing up. But another part of me, the stronger, wiser part, decided to face them. I walked to the door and opened it slowly. My mother's eyes met mine, and for the first time in my life, I saw something unfamiliar in her gaze, vulnerability. "Adeline," she began, her voice softer than I'd ever heard. "We didn't expect things to turn out this way." "No," I replied calmly. "You expected me to be the same girl you could push aside." My father stepped forward, clearing his throat. "We thought maybe we could talk, work something out, as a family." I almost laughed at the irony, family, a word they had weaponized against me countless times in the past. I took a deliberate step back and said, "This office is not a courtroom, and it's not my childhood home. If you're here to manipulate, guilt, or take, then you can turn around and leave. But if you're here to acknowledge what you did, then maybe we can talk, not as the broken family you abandoned, but as adults who understand consequences." They exchanged uncertain glances. For once, the power dynamic had shifted entirely. I wasn't the overlooked daughter anymore. I was the woman standing in her own empire, the one they had underestimated for too long. I didn't give them an answer that night. I let them leave with the weight of their choices pressing down on them. Months passed after the verdict. The media eventually moved on, the courtroom drama fading into memory. But my life continued to flourish. I expanded my grandfather's charitable foundations, invested in projects he had dreamed of but never got to finish, and built a future that honored his name in a way that wasn't about wealth. It was about purpose, and sometimes when I drove past my parents' neighborhood, I'd see them walking outside together. They didn't wave, and neither did I. But occasionally, our eyes would meet, and in those brief seconds, there was an unspoken understanding. They had lost more than just money. They had lost the chance to truly know me. That was my quiet revenge. Not through cruelty or bitterness, but through success, dignity, and the unshakable strength they never believed I possessed.